The first thing that an authoritarian regime does when it wants to take over a society is it ruthlessly destroys the family.
You think every man should have to serve the country?
You have an entire generation of young people who are no longer resilient. In 1973, there were two things that radically changed how Americans view themselves, how men and women view themselves. I see kind of all of history as a war between the family and the state.
What do you mean by that? The attack on the American family?
Yeah, no, it's I wrote a speech that I gave a couple months ago where I really started talking about how I see kind of all of history as a war between the family and the state. These two big institutions. One is, and it goes back to Plato. It goes back to like the Republic, the Greeks, right, where the entire philosophy of the Republic is that perhaps the state can take better care of a society than these institutional families. And so when you look at you go back through history and you see that, especially authoritarian regimes, the first thing that an authoritarian regime does when it wants to take over a society is it ruthlessly destroys the family. So you mentioned the one-child policy in China. That was an attack, a deliberate attack on the family from an authoritarian regime. And the purpose of it was, it was for national interest. They talk about, we couldn't, we wouldn't be able to supply enough people with food. But what it really was to weaken the only institution that can ever combat the state, which is the family. And so I'm a pretty conspiratorial person. I think there's been a concerted attack on the family to strengthen the state, particularly for the last 50 years. But it's been done in very specific ways, in legal ways, through the education system, through the medical system, and it is deliberately destroyed. And you see it through the birth rate, like we talked about in the beginning. Fewer and fewer people want to have families, and it's because of this deliberate attack on the family. And I wrote this piece called "The War on Suffering," where I've been very vocal about the fact that I think everything in America changed in 1973. Everyone always there's this website called WTF happened in 1971. And it points to, that's when we came off the gold standard. That's when, regulations started exploding in America. What happened in this year where, everything bad in America started like from this moment where you just see just complete change in a lot of things around America. And I've always said that might have been the economic change that happened in America, where financialization started and where, housing became so expensive, where it became ridiculously expensive to afford healthcare or education. But in 1973, there were two things that radically changed how Americans view themselves, how men and women view themselves, and ultimately what I think is sort of the impetus and start of this sort of unraveling of the family. And I've said this a lot publicly on what I think changed for men, which was 1973 in January. Nixon did the most profound and most popular thing that he ever did during his presidency, which was that he ended the draft. It was unanimous. It was, coming off of Vietnam. It was like a unanimous thing that everyone loved. Everyone knew what needed to happen, where he said, we're going to be an all volunteer force and we're going to allow people to choose to serve their country. And of course, this is something that even today, people, our military celebrates the fact that we don't have a draft, that, this is part of American culture. But I think what it fundamentally said to young people is that it is a choice to serve. It is a choice. Not everyone does it. Only the people who want to. They might want to do it for economic reasons. They might want to do it for love of country. But it is not something that everyone has to do to serve and defend their country. And if you think about it, throughout human history, that is the first time that a country has said to young men, your purpose on this earth is not to defend where you live. And it was codified. It was like, that is not the purpose of manhood. And then 10 days later, and it was only in 2023 when I was writing this piece that I actually even realized this, 10 days later, the female equivalent happened, where Roe v. Wade passed from the Supreme Court. And that had a similar impact on women, where it used to be, for all of human history, your purpose on this earth is to have children, is to have a family. And this was the first time, and in Western society too, a lot of nations copied us after it, but this was the moment that really changed, where 10 days after men were told your purpose is not to serve, women were told your purpose is not to have a family, it's your choice.
Wow.
And so it completely changes the view of how men view themselves and how women view themselves, all in 1973, January, 10 days. And it's like, I would say there's a lot of people who would say, well, these are all good things. It's really good that there's choice in America. Not everyone should have to serve their country. Like, not everyone, men and women shouldn't have to go to war, or women shouldn't have to become mothers. But what we didn't do in that moment is we didn't provide anyone an alternative purpose. We didn't provide men and women anything that says, actually, the purpose of manhood is this. Or actually, the purpose of womanhood is this. We just said, go figure it out yourself. Actually, maybe there is no purpose. In the 70s, like there was this very clear, kind of, I would say almost like nihilistic culture of, well, nothing really matters anymore. Like you can do whatever you want. And like that I think has permeated, so much of society where we don't even believe suffering should exist anymore. It's, it's like the suffering for your country is why would anyone do that? Suffering for your family, why would you do that? But I think the minute that we destroyed, the unique purpose of woman, which for, you can't debate that for millennial, that was the purpose of women, was to bear children and to have family. And then the unique purpose of man, which is to fight. The minute that we destroyed those purposes, men and women stopped relating to each other. They didn't know they didn't know who they were. They didn't know what their purpose was. They didn't know how they could relate. And when you look at it from that framework, the family was destined to fail from that moment.
Damn. You think every man should have to serve the country?
No. That I think is I don't know that every man needs to go to war, right? But I think there is something that happens when you say, we once were a country where everyone was treated this way. Everyone knew their purpose. Everyone woke up in the morning and knew, at 18, there is a chance I will have to serve my country. And that, just understanding that that is your purpose, changes the way you walk. It changes the way that you think about your life. And the same thing for, I don't think every woman should have to be a mother. If I talk to, 9 people or 10 people, 9 out of 10 people would say, of course, like these are good things, right? These are popular things. But at the same time, when we didn't replace that purpose with something else, and we didn't have a way of saying, this is how society should be organized.
You're saying that it changed the consciousness of the country.
Yes. And the thing that we did instead was, instead of, serving your country is an outward focused thing. It's focused on other people. It's focused on someone other than you. The same thing with being a mother. The minute you become a mother, you stop worrying about yourself, right? Like you don't have time to make yourself the most important thing. Like you have to worry about your children. So in both of those cases, those purposes, they were outwardly focused. They were things where this is how we organize society, and you care about the institution of family, and the men care about the institution of their country. And then, but what we did instead was we turned inward. We started focusing on our own mind. And this is like the moment that we really start thinking about, psychology, like who am I? What is my purpose on this earth? There's a great book by Philip Reith that was written in the 60s, actually, called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, which is that, man really started turning inward in the 60s and early 70s and really thinking about, like, do I have purpose on this earth, and what is this? And the minute that you stop focusing outward and you become very contemplative, which is really what American culture has become, you become very individualistic, become very obsessed with yourself. Our generation is, the trophy generation, the me generation of like everything, everything about me is interesting, and I'm an individual and I can achieve anything I want. There's no barriers, there's no limitations, but it completely rips out all of the sort of underpinnings of what makes a society function. And I think in some ways that those were sort of the moments where it's like, then you saw the unraveling of, well, there shouldn't be any kind of suffering. Like, it's around the same time that no fault divorce happened, around the same time that, you shouldn't be told who you are, you shouldn't be judged. Similarly in the medical arena, this is around the time where ADHD sort of, the late 80s, SSRIs started really coming about, where it's like we have to start medicating us because we're thinking too much about ourselves and we have too much depression. And of course, depression, the SSRIs, I think, were seen as kind of a niche thing. And now they're, what is the number of Americans that are on them? The sort of focus on the move to focus on the self was a very deliberate action. And I think that the crisis of the family comes from the fact that if you're focused on yourself, you really can't be focused on a family. And you hear this all the time from young people. It's like, I haven't achieved what I wanted. I can barely take care of myself at mid-20s. I don't know who I am. How am I going to be able to take care of a kid? And we've forgotten that, like, previous generations, they didn't have that luxury. They didn't have the extended adolescence where they could, say, oh, well, I don't know myself. Like, how am I going to go to war if I don't know myself? Like, the greatest generation wasn't able to say that. They just had to do it. And in some ways, it's like, we can definitely make the argument that things are better now. And in many ways, like, people People, are living longer. Like they're, you can definitely make the argument that these things were not necessarily good for society, but at least there was a societal purpose and organization. And I think the thing that has really been corrupted over the last 50 years is that we do not know what our American purpose is. We just, and particularly as it comes to the family, family has become an option. It's no longer the default institution that you build your life in.
Yeah.
And without that default institution you build your life in, people they flail. You have the loneliness epidemic. You have young women and men who...
Depression,
exactly.
For any men out there that are wondering what your purpose is, it's to provide for your fucking family and protect them. That's it. No. But I didn't realize there was that much confusion out there about it. But then, you look around and where are all the men?
Yeah.
Where did they go?
Yeah. To quote the New York Times.
Yeah. Right. So, I wish I would have known you were a conspiratorial person, because otherwise we'd be talking about aliens and the pyramids and Machu Picchu and all kinds of other shit. But so the question is, you had mentioned, those were draft-ended pro-choice or Roe v. Wade, 10 days apart. So is this just the result of shitty decision-making? The list goes... I'm not weighing in on those subjects, but what I'm saying is, it sounds like you think that's where it started. Then we see, all the stuff with the gender stuff nowadays, and Washington State, the state will come and take your kid if you don't do the gender affirming care, and there's just a whole number of things. And so, is it stemming from somewhere, or is this just a result of decisions?
I think it's a result of both legal and medical decisions, because I think the medical community has a huge part of this as well. But I think it comes down to the war on suffering has been won. We've defeated suffering, and life is not about suffering. That is what I think our legal system thinks. That's what our medical system thinks. When you think of the opioid epidemic, what started the opioid epidemic in the 90s? It was the belief in the medical community that suffering from back pain is one of the worst things that can happen, and that there's a magical pill that you can take that's going to get you off of back pain. And then there were pill mills across America handing out opioids because people couldn't deal with suffering. And that was seen as a good thing. Like, don't you want to eradicate suffering? Same thing with ADHD. Young boys, it's like they can't focus in school. Here's a magical pill, and you're not going to suffer anymore. Your family's not going to suffer. Your teacher's not going to suffer. You're going to feel great. And now 23% of boys at 17 years old are on ADHD medication in America. And it's because we just do not believe that anyone should have to suffer. We don't believe in resilience. We don't believe that anyone should have to make a choice that has something to do with society or something that is duty versus what they want to do. It's all individualistic. And I think, the best example of the war on suffering is what hasn't happened fully in the US, but it's happening in the UK. It already happened in Canada, which is if you now suffer from mental illness, you have the right to die. If you're over 18, you are welcome to go to a doctor who will sign off of it, and you can end your life. And
suicide machines.
And that was not the America we lived in before.
Yeah.
So the question is, why are we so opposed to suffering? And I get a lot of pushback from people on this. Well, why are you pro suffering? And I'm a practicing Catholic. The entire story of Catholicism is about Jesus suffering. For something noble, for something good, for us, right? But it is a story of suffering. And the movement to try to pull the story of suffering out of human life, that's removing human nature. That's removing the entire Christian story out of how we live, and saying you are not expected to suffer, what happens then? You have an entire generation of young people who are no longer resilient. So I think one of the biggest lies is
I think it takes drive away, too.
Oh, 100%.
Takes personal drive away.
Yeah.
Which creates less innovators.
Totally. Which is why I do think, like, a lot of these young people, the reason they go to Silicon Valley and they sleep on the factory floor and they work hard and they're building hard things is because they know that suffering is inherently, like, there is something good about suffering for a purpose greater than yourself. But I do think that people are confused about how to find that. Like, how do you find that outside of a society that tells you don't need to get married, you don't need to have kids, you don't need to serve your country, you don't need to do something greater than yourself for your community, you don't need to be a pillar of the community anymore, you can move wherever you want, just total freedom. And I think without those guardrails or those guides or people who can help you navigate life, like, people just get lost.
No matter where you're watching Sean Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.